Stop what you are doing, because this may be the moment this war stopped being a dangerous regional crisis and started becoming something much bigger. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Right now. Because when people hear the words Strait of Hormuz, most of them think about oil. They think about tankers, shipping lanes, global markets, and gasoline prices. But what they are missing is far more dangerous than that. Hormuz is not just an energy choke point. It is a pressure valve for the entire Middle East. And when that valve starts to rupture, the shock does not stay in one place. It spreads into militaries, into governments, into shipping, into the global economy, and into the calculations of leaders who may already be closer to escalation than they are willing to admit. That is why what is happening right now matters so much, because even before anyone can fully sort out every battlefield claim, one thing is already clear. The Hormuz crisis has just entered a much more dangerous phase. U.S.-Iran talks have broken down. Washington has announced a blockade of Iranian ports. Iran has answered with threats. The Kremlin is warning about serious market fallout. And the entire world is now watching one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth, as if the next move there could set off a much wider chain reaction. And that is exactly why you need to watch this whole video. Because this is no longer just a story about whether bombs exploded, whether missiles flew, or whether one side hit another base. This is now a story about whether the war has reached the point where everyone involved is beginning to test not just military limits, but systemic limits. The kind of limits that turn a conflict into a global emergency. Now here is what has actually happened. On April 13th, the United States moved ahead with a naval blockade targeting maritime traffic entering and leaving Iranian ports. Reuters reported that the Kremlin quickly warned the move would be bad for international markets. Other reporting says the decision came after peace talks stalled and that the blockade applies to vessels going to and from Iranian ports, while transit for non-Iranian routes through Hormuz remains under military watch. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is a major escalation in one of the most militarized and economically sensitive waterways in the world. And once that happened, things got worse immediately. Not because a blockade automatically means total war, but because a blockade changes the logic of the crisis. Before this, the conflict was already severe. The war that began on February 28th with U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran had expanded across multiple fronts. There were missile attacks, airstrikes, maritime threats, fragile ceasefire efforts, and a widening sense that no one really controlled the pace anymore. But a blockade in Hormuz adds something new. It turns the war from a contest of punishment into a contest of access. Access to ports, access to trade, access to leverage, access to survival. And that matters because states do not treat blockades like routine headlines. They treat them like red lines. Now step back and think about what Hormuz actually is. This is one of the most important shipping routes on Earth. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas trade normally passes through or around this choke point. When traffic there is disrupted, the effects do not remain inside the Gulf. They hit Europe. They hit Asia. They hit financial markets. They hit energy planning. They hit insurance. They hit supply chains. Reuters reported just days ago that the strait was effectively shut under Iranian pressure and that major Gulf energy leaders were calling for it to reopen immediately and without conditions. So when tensions in Hormuz get worse, this is not just another battlefield development. It becomes a world event. That is why this is so dangerous. Because the closer this crisis moves toward direct confrontation at sea, the more ways there are for it to spiral. One vessel stopped, one warning ignored, one fast attack boat misread, one radar lock, one missile launch, one mine, one strike on coastal infrastructure, one decision made in seconds that cannot be reversed. That is how a crisis in a narrow waterway becomes a wider war. And right now, all the ingredients are there. The peace talks have stalled. AP reported that Trump announced the blockade as pressure on Tehran to reopen the strait and agree to terms after diplomacy failed to produce a breakthrough. Iran has responded with threats that no port in the region would be safe. This is no longer the language of de-escalation. This is the language of coercion meeting counter-coercion in real time. Now here is where most people still underestimate the danger. They think the biggest risk is a spectacular strike. It might not be. The bigger risk may be sustained instability. Because once shipping lanes enter the war, the pressure becomes constant. Every tanker becomes a question. Every naval movement becomes a signal. Every insurance adjustment becomes a warning. Every market spike becomes a political problem. And every military commander in the region has to start thinking less about isolated retaliation and more about long-duration confrontation. That is a much darker phase of conflict, and it is one the United States may now be stepping into. The Wall Street Journal and Reuters reporting both point to the same basic reality. This is no longer just about punishing Iran or forcing short-term compliance. A blockade is operationally demanding, politically risky, and inherently escalatory. It requires sustained presence, continuous decisions, and clear willingness to confront whatever response comes next. Analysts cited in the journal warned that keeping control over such a narrow, heavily militarized corridor could become an open-ended operation with major risks. That means Washington is no longer just signaling strength. It is betting that Iran will blink first. And that is exactly the kind of bet that makes Hormuz so dangerous. Because Iran still has options. Not unlimited options. Not easy options, but real options. Iran can threaten shipping. It can raise insurance costs. It can force rerouting. It can push regional partners into crisis planning. It can raise the risk premium on every decision around the Gulf. And perhaps most importantly, it can make the cost of enforcement higher than the cost of defiance. That is the strategic trap. You do not always defeat a stronger power by breaking it in one blow. Sometimes you exhaust it by making control too expensive, too dangerous, and too politically messy to sustain. And in a place like Hormuz, that is possible because geography itself works for the escalator. Narrow waters, heavy traffic, close coastlines, militarized shores, fast boats, missiles, drones, mines, surveillance, miscalculation. Everything about this environment punishes certainty. Now think about the timing. This escalation is happening after a 6-week war, after fragile ceasefire efforts, after threats to infrastructure, after oil market shock, after repeated signs that the region has not stabilized at all. Reuters reported that the U.S. blockade begins as uncertainty over the larger conflict remains unresolved. AP reported that the ceasefire expires on April 22nd, with no durable breakthrough in hand. In other words, the blockade is not arriving in a calm environment. It is arriving in an environment already overloaded with distrust. That is a recipe for dangerous decisions. And this is where your title really hits the nerve of the story. Things just got worse. Yes, they did. Because whether or not every viral battlefield claim about a Hormuz base checks out, the strategic reality is unmistakable. The center of gravity is shifting toward the strait itself, toward ports, toward coastal access, toward energy arteries, toward the basic mechanics of whether states can keep trade and military movement alive in one of the world's most critical corridors. That is a massive deterioration. Now here is the contradiction at the heart of this moment. Publicly, leaders want to project control. Trump wants pressure. Iran wants defiance. U.S. commanders want deterrence. Regional governments want calm. Markets want reassurance. But structurally, nobody can fully control what happens once coercion and counter-coercion collide in Hormuz. That is the truth. You can declare a blockade. You can threaten retaliation. You can deploy ships. You can issue warnings, but you cannot guarantee that the next move will stay limited. And that is why this is no longer just about the Gulf. This is about what happens when a local crisis starts threatening the operating system of the global economy. Oil prices have already reacted sharply. AP said prices surged past $100 per barrel after the blockade announcement. Reuters and other outlets have repeatedly underlined how exposed global markets are to prolonged disruption around Hormuz. And once that pressure starts showing up in fuel, freight, industry, and inflation, governments far beyond the region begin to feel the war as a domestic problem. That is how regional wars become international crises, not only through alliances or troop movements, but through choke points, through systems, through the places where trade, energy, and military pressure all overlap. And Hormuz is one of the clearest examples on Earth. Now let's talk about the military side for a second. A blockade sounds straightforward when politicians announce it. In reality, it is complicated, exhausting, and vulnerable. Ships must be identified. Intent must be interpreted. Rules of engagement must be maintained under extreme pressure. Civilian traffic must be separated from military risk. Neutral states must be reassured. Allies must be briefed. Adversaries must be deterred without triggering something larger. And all of that has to happen in real time. One mistake there is not just tactical. It is strategic. That is why the Reuters line from the Kremlin matters. Moscow warned that this would be bad for markets. That is more than commentary. It is recognition that everyone understands the same thing. Once Hormuz becomes the center of an enforcement campaign, the margin for error collapses, and Iran knows that too. Which means Tehran does not necessarily need to win a direct showdown at sea to gain leverage. It may only need to keep the situation unstable enough that enforcement becomes costly, risky, and politically divisive. That is the danger U.S. planners are now facing. Can they deter Iran without triggering a wider clash? Can they enforce access without owning every consequence? Can they keep allies on board if energy prices climb and shipping risk rises? Can they sustain military pressure in a corridor designed by geography to punish overconfidence? Those are not small questions. They are the questions. Because if the answer to even one of them starts to slip, this crisis could move very fast. That is why no serious observer should treat this as just another dramatic Middle East headline. This is the kind of development that changes the frame of the war, from strikes to strangulation, from retaliation to access, from battlefield damage to systemic risk. And that shift is what makes the situation so much more dangerous tonight than it was even a few days ago. So where does this go next? There are really only three paths. 1. Diplomacy recovers, back-channel pressure works, and some formula is found to reopen the strait while avoiding direct naval confrontation. 2. The blockade holds in a tense, unstable form, with no major direct clash but constant risk, rising costs, and deepening global economic strain. Or 3. One encounter goes wrong, one side escalates to restore credibility, and the Strait of Hormuz becomes not just a pressure point, but an active front line. That third scenario is the one everyone fears, because once that starts, it will not stay about one ship, one port, or one explosion. It will become about control, about endurance, about who can keep the artery open, who can keep pressure on, and who can absorb the consequences of a confrontation in one of the most dangerous waterways in the world. So yes, things just got worse, not because every rumor is true, but because the verified facts are already bad enough. The blockade is real. The diplomacy has stalled. The threats are escalating. The markets are reacting. And the Strait of Hormuz is now closer to the center of this war than ever before. And if there is one question hanging over everything tonight, it is not whether this crisis is serious. It is whether anyone still has enough control left to stop the next move from pushing it over the edge. Because when the world's most important choke point starts looking like a battlefield, the danger is not only what explodes first, it is what follows after.